Welcome to the Conduit Deeper podcast, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the details that surround our current sermon series, from current events to fascinating finds to conversations that take us deeper into the Word. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to our Deeper podcast. My name is Mo, executive pastor at Conduit Church, and we are not joined with our lead pastor, Darren Tyler. He is unavailable today. So in his stead, we decided to bring in our good friends, the Blurry boys, Nate Henry, Luke Rogers from Blurry Creatures podcast, which you have heard us talk about, the Blurry Creatures podcast. You may be aware that we've hosted BlurryCon, which has caused all kinds of problems.
Good problems.
The greatest of problems.
Yeah. Okay, good. It's good they're good problems.
Yeah, exactly. Can we use fog machines? Can we not use fog machines?
Right.
Pyrotechnics in this building? No, in this building.
And so for those of you that already know about Blurry Creatures, I'm sure you're very excited for this podcast. For those of you that have no idea what we're talking about, I would love the opportunity to ask Nate and Luke, what is Blurry Creatures? How did this come together? What is it about? What's the purpose of the podcast?
I think the podcast started with talking about Bigfoot. I mean, that was the basic DNA and the recipe of this podcast.
To start there.
Yeah. Just because
the weird podcast started with something real weird.
So, the story is before the podcast started, I was kind of researching stories and watching documentaries about Bigfoot of all things. It was just weird enough, but plausible. And it was just the right kind of coast to coast, paranormal, strange. And then, after 5-6 years of doing that, just kind of it became a little bit more than an obsession. I guess I was like, or a hobby, I guess, towards the obsession range of like, okay, I'm thinking about this a lot and I'm talking about this a lot with friends and family. People probably think I'm a little weird, but I just couldn't get enough of it. And around 2019 was like listening to podcasts and people started talking about, theologians started coming on a lot of this Bigfoot paranormal stuff that I was kind of in these rabbit holes. I'm like, wait, what does this have to do with what it could possibly Bigfoot and theology? How do these things even cross?
It's a great question. I don't know if that sentence has ever really been said until
now. No.
Bigfoot and theology.
On this show.
Yeah.
So 2019 got a logo design and just was like working on fixing up the third house that I had been of a course of a couple years, like fixing up houses. And that's why I got into podcasts to kind of keep me company. And the name Blurry Creatures just popped in my head one day and was like, okay, I'm going to get the .com. And then I had a friend design a logo. And then I just sat around and thought about it for a while. And then Luke was tweeting about Bigfoot one day.
It's true.
And I was like, and we had done some, we did
a fateful tweet. Yeah.
We had been, did some podcast episodes. We did a live podcast with the Bad Christian podcast. Yeah. And then we met there at the singer of Emery's house, actually. Or re-met.
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
That part doesn't make the story a lot.
It doesn't.
Wasn't that like an election?
Yeah, it was a live podcast on Bad Christian
during the election.
Yeah. And then
could go wrong with
we became pals. We were NorCal kids and we had a bunch of mutual friends.
Well, our history goes back even farther. Like Nate was in a band called Sherwood for a long time, and in our college days, he was at San Luis Obispo, was at Chico State. He's from Sacramento, I'm from Chico, Northern California.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of mutual crossover because my friends, I was like the bro jock that hung out with all the band guys because I wasn't in a band. But my best friends were all in bands and they ended up playing shows with Sherwood. So Nate and I had this crossover like 20 years plus years ago.
Yeah.
So I knew Nate in sort of an ancillary way and had met him. And then we were friends. And then he had a podcast before actually. With Matt McDonald, you had the Don't Feed the Trolls that I did an episode with you guys.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we had all this crossover, and then I always had sort of not the level of interest in Bigfoot, but kind of like a funny ha-ha to the point where I loved watching the shows, finding Bigfoot where they never found him, of course. It's sort of, spoiler alert, it's like 20th season. They haven't found him yet. But my mom would always buy me some Bigfoot thing, at Christmas to put in my stocking because it was like this joke that I liked those shows and I liked Bigfoot and and then there was Nate reached out. I had a podcast before. Nate had a podcast before with my brother that we did. It was a sports variety show. It did well, but we ended up killing it. because he had a contract renewal with ESPN. It's a long story. They wanted to kind of own the content, and we didn't want them to own it. It was the beginning of very controversial things at that network, and we didn't want them to sort of have creative dictative ability into the show, and we just killed it. And I had actually written down that year, this is 2020, like I stopped doing New Year's resolutions because this is a great way to feel like failing every year to start your year. And just wrote down goals. And that year I'd written, I want to get back into podcasting. I want to have a podcast. And I had an idea for a show I was going to do by myself. And then Nate reached out and he's like, hey, you want to do a podcast on Bigfoot? And I was like, yes.
But with like, but there's this whole spiritual element to it as well. It's not
he called me and explained all this to me. And I was like, I love that. Let's, And it was cool because like Nate said, these are conversations he was having with his friends. Conversations were in this sort of vein or conversations I was having with my friends, like, and still to this day are conversations I have with my friends, not because we do Blurry Creatures, because like sort of talking about the mysterious things in life and the unknown and the things that like you want to kind of break your brain on are things I like to do anyway. I like to have a cigar and a bourbon and sit around and talk about those things. And so this was kind of a way to do that. And we just said we'd do this. Yeah. In my mind, we're doing this if just my parents and our buddies listened. It wasn't, we never actually started out to be like, we're going to make this a thing. We didn't even have a website till like episode 30 or something. It was just a fun thing where we were like, let's just talk to people we're interested in talking to about weird stuff.
Well, there's plenty of weird stuff to talk about. I mean, our church family is going through the book of Genesis right now.
Yeah.
Starting in chapter 1, verse 1. And there's plenty in Genesis that gets weird pretty quick. I mean, we're talking, talking serpents and Nephilim and seraphims and all kinds of crazy things happening just in the first few chapters.
Sure.
So what about, you mentioned the spiritual side, like what, so you have this obsession with Bigfoot.
Yeah.
How did you start to kind of blend these two things together?
Yeah.
And, kind of go down the proverbial rabbit hole?
Well, I think that a lot of guys were talking about the Nephilim all of a sudden, and I don't know why, but I grew up in the church and I was still interested in the conversation, was still interested in, I think we're all at that age where if you're still kind of going to church or you're having spiritual conversations, you have some of that, you're confused from like a lot of the things because you grew up around you have these questions and you never really get good answers for them. But you haven't like abandoned your faith completely. I think a lot of people do in their late 20s, 30s. They say they get sort of jaded and they walk away. But if you're still kind of around the water cooler, you need better answers. And I think that some of these theologians were like, well, there was this point in history, and the Bible talks about it, when you had the sons of God mentioned in Genesis 6, mating with the daughters of men, and there's these two distinct characters. And they had this offspring that were the giants that, we know the most famous story is David and Goliath, but that's just a snapshot of a whole history of all these ites, like the Canaanites, the Amalekites, all these tribes that we thought growing up in the church were probably just bad human tribes doing bad things, but not like actually could be genetic anomalies. And because my mind was primed for the Bigfoot conversation, because I had heard hundreds and hundreds of police officers, Parks and Rec, and all these people that, were credible, they were telling their stories, and it's the same story over and over again. It was like, wait a minute, this isn't the first time in history where there could be these genetic random things on our planet. And then you start looking at like, well, why is Greek history so weird? And they call it mythology, but it sounds like history. So, and people really know a lot about these things, and people are talking about, this creature having these paranormal abilities, but that's not like any animal that I know. And how come it's so bizarre? So,
those are the first 10 episodes. So we really, first 10 of in our catalog were Bigfoot, and it ranged from like Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who's like, this is a relic ape.
Yeah.
And I have 10,000 cast footprints and a butt print. I always like to bring that up, and all these other things, right? But he's like, it's definitely like a Gigantopithecus. It's this, but then the other end of the spectrum within this is what they call the woo, which is all this weird stuff around Bigfoot. Like he disappears, he mind speaks, or he or she, Patty was a she. All this weird sort of woo kind of.
Patty is the famous 1967 Bigfoot that was filmed.
Picture.
Yeah.
Where she's walking and looks back.
Yeah, but like paranormal stuff around it, right? So in episode 11, we went to giants. And that was the segue. It was like, okay, you have these people that think there's two camps. It's a relic ape, or it's something else, and it does a lot of weird stuff, and maybe there's portals.
Yeah.
But
is it a giant kind of thing?
Right.
Is it a remnant of the giant? Is it, is it some sort of experiment gone wrong? Because it seemed as though when this angelic DNA and human DNA got together, it created these sort of literal abominations, things that weren't supposed to be here. So, and that's, I guess we could talk about like, there's concepts of free will. I mean, why would God allow these things to happen? But it explains some of the major events in the Old Testament. It explains some of the, catastrophic events in the Old Testament and why God commands his people to do crazy things that modern day humans go, well, that's not nice and that's not fair.
It's genocide. It's
Yeah.
like, it really does help provide a context to the conquest of Joshua, right? But you have to go back to Genesis. And so it's funny, we were here the first week with Hugh Ross when he spoke, when you guys kicked off Genesis, and we interviewed Hugh for our show, and you guys started with creation. But it's wild there, but it just continues to kind of get crazy. And like Nate said, some of the things that frustrate folks in church. I know this is not the case with Conduit because we know you guys well, and Darren does an amazing job of not glossing over or skipping what most evangelical and Christian spaces would be things that are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Genesis 6 is I spent my entire childhood and adult life never hearing about what Genesis 6, 4 verses was even about, right? And that was a whole mind-altering, paradigm-altering thing for my faith. But what it did, as Nate was saying, it applied all this context to the flood, to the prophecy of Genesis 3, to everything that happened after that, and then after Noah, to the return of the giants, and then conquest of Joshua. What Nate was touching on is what's happened to a lot of folks in our generation, I think, is that people deconstruct, right? Mike Heiser, who was really, in some ways, like sort of the impetus for the show in a lot of ways, and we lost Dr. Michael Heiser last year to cancer, but he wrote a few books, seminal books, I believe, in the Unseen Realm being that one. One thing he said that has always stuck with me is the Bible was written for you, but not to you. Right? It was written to an ancient peoples. And in order to understand the context of things like Genesis, the book of Genesis, you have to think and put yourself in the shoes and in the head of an ancient Semitic person. And we don't do that. We act like in the 21st century, we've got it all figured out in the books written to us. And so when you do that, there's a lot of folks now in the progressive spaces that will say, well, I can't believe in a God that does X, Y, Z. And a lot of it is, sponsors and genocide in the Holy Land, the conquest of Joshua.
Or just like floods a world.
Or destroys humanity. Like
creates a world, floods it.
That's not a God I can trust or I can serve. And what I think is missing.
Or even some people go so as far as say to kill his own son. Why would he do that?
Right.
And they don't even believe in that because they go so progressive that they can't sponsor any sort of violence. And I think I was having a lot of these conversations with friends, and I was like, this is why this podcast needs to be started, because people have no context for the weird stuff, but the whole Old Testament, most of it is strange. And we sort of watch a movie. I think Christians like to watch, the Gospels. It's like this 10% of the good part of the film, but they don't have any, wait a minute, you walk into a half over movie and you're like, wait, what happened I don't understand. Who's this guy? What's he doing? Oh, and it's dynamic and you see Jesus is saving humanity, but you're like, from what? Yeah. And then a lot of the answers are from you. It's your fault. And it's like, entirely my fault? Well, there's actually 3 major problems going on in the Old Testament. And guys like Heiser get into that. There's 3 rebellions in the Old Testament. And the Genesis 3 is the first one. And then you have Genesis 6. And then, you have this Tower of Babel event later. And you're like, okay, there's a ton of stuff going wrong. And that is like the free will thing I was talking about earlier, that God allows human beings and his other created beings, which are these angelic beings, which there's probably a whole,
host is the word.
Yeah.
A whole host.
Different types of those, right? We know that they have job titles, and we know that some of them don't look like the same probably, and some of them look like us. And, that's where the podcast kind of just exploded, is like exploring these topics. And every once in a while we get bored or we get too heavy in the theology. We bring back, well, this person saw gray aliens. Or this person saw a UFO. This person
shot Bigfoot.
This person shot Bigfoot. Or this guy saw an actual giant in Afghanistan. And you're like, he's a military guy, films it on thermal, and he hasn't been able to explain this to anybody or tell his friends because everyone thinks he's crazy.
Kandahar?
Yeah. Well, no, this was same region, same time, but this was just, he saw this thing stand up next to a tree and he said this thing was over 12 feet tall. And, some of these paranormal stories that the average Christian's just like, wait, what are you talking about? Like, you believe that stuff? You think you actually have these conversations on your podcast? And it's like, well, yeah, your whole Bible is full of these stories too.
It's full of it. And that's why I love that you guys have created an outlet to ask these questions.
Like normalize it almost, right?
Well, I mean, the gospel starts with, I've heard you guys say this before, it starts with a virgin birth and ends in a resurrection. I mean, that's
some wild stuff.
It starts with an astrological event. Have the stars coming together, and then you have,
Immaculate Conception.
You have
virgin birth.
You have angels appearing to the shepherds. And it's like, who are they? Where do they come from? And what are they like? And why are they there? I think we have this. Like a lot of people have said, we almost have a Gnostic view of the spiritual part of the Bible. That it's like, it's more.
Not we as in blurry creatures, but like we.
As Christians, we've adopted more of a Gnostic view, and then we have an actual practical view that maybe an angel could walk in this building right now and is just like us, talks, could interact with us to the point where we wouldn't even know.
Or like ruggedly handsome,
Wears his hat backwards, maybe.
Yeah.
Not that handsome.
Yeah. But, those kinds of concepts where we have sort of, medieval perspectives almost, that like it would be like a spirit that comes, like a ghost would come in, and then we would know that's an angel, it's a ghost. But maybe it's more practical to view it as like another, just a higher created being than us. But what are we? We're spirit, we're flesh. So I think those concepts have to be thought about when you can actually say, well, Genesis 6, we can read this literal, that angels and humans hooked up, and they weren't supposed to, but they were similar enough to have this DNA match, but also
the result was
catastrophic for humans. Yeah.
Yeah. Now that you guys have kind of studied this for the past 4 years.
This is year 4.
This is year 4.
Year 4.
Mosephus.
Yeah, I like that one. Year 4.
We know a little bit.
Tons of guests.
We know Mo now than we did before.
No Mo. You know Mo than you did before. Now that you've gone down this multiple times with multiple guests, who were these angels? Like, what's your take on the angels coming down and being with the daughters? Like, what exactly is your take on who these people even were? Were they angels?
Well, they were.
What kind of angels?
Watchers.
So this is interesting, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it starts to open up a little bit of...
Sure.
Well, I think you have to go back, and the things that we start with in this conversation, because we've done it a bunch, is the idea of angel in itself just being a Greek term, angelos, which just means messenger. It actually isn't a like kingdom phylum of anything. It just means messenger. It's a job. And then if you talk about watchers, which is a term we use on that comes from the first Enoch, especially with that term watcher, which is also in Daniel, is also just a job. So they're essentially, it's like, pastor or construction worker or, what professional golfer, whatever. It's a job, right? So that is in itself kind of makes it cryptic. We don't get a whole lot of information. We know that, as Nate was saying, a lot of things happen with angels in the Bible. They walk into Sodom, right? The angel of the Lord wrestles with Jacob. The angel of the Lord shows up and eats with Abraham. They do a lot of like real physical, practical things. So,
yeah, and that's what they're eating in the wilderness. They're eating the food of heaven, angel
bread, baby.
Yeah, so it's
angel food cake.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is just like strange concepts. I think they get hungry like we do, and they somehow developed a lust for human beings, right? And these concepts are hard for people because, I don't know, there's some sort of disassociation between everything is, we've heard a lot of people on our show say, I don't like the term supernatural, because what it does is it says there's this way and then there's this other way that's beyond, like there's this natural way of things. And like, what if all of this is, supernatural? What if all of this is, can be categorized as supernatural, and we sort of disassociate these things, and then when you read the stories that seem outside of your day-to-day, you put them in a different place instead of putting them, no, this is all one story. And this is all a miracle. This is all strange and crazy. I mean, what we're doing right now is a crazy concept. If you really just think about what's happening right now, to just have this conversation and where we are in history and where we are in the galaxy. And I don't know, I think that we've divorced ourselves from just the phenomenal part of the story. And so when we read this idea of angels and humans, like, come on, that's nuts. And then they developed this other alternate theory called the Sethite theory,
right?
Which they interjected this whole other narrative with someone who's not even in the building when it comes to like characters. And then they kind of said, well, it's just a different line of humans, and they're just like bad. They're just bad dudes, just a bunch of bad dudes. And it's like, okay, well then, where do we get demons? Where do they come from? Where do we get these giants that are in the land? I mean, in Numbers, it says they're as big as, cedar trees, cedars of Lebanon, which those were up to 25 to 40 feet tall. So, I mean, I don't think those are just random heights they're throwing out there. I think they knew. And I think that's why only a few of the spies even wanted to go in there, because I mean, imagine looking down over the hill and be like, we're not going in there. I mean, we're not going to take these guys.
But the angelic mixing was the view of up until about 400 AD. So you're talking about the time of Christ, before Christ, all of these, that was the interpretation, that was the belief system at the time of Christ, and Christ is learned in the temple. This is what they believed up until at some point in the 400-ish, they decided this was a little uncomfortable. So we're going to sort of try to find a way to massage that. And what we've talked about from a theological standpoint with theologians is there are so many more hoops and bad assumptions and bad hermeneutics and et cetera and exegesis that you have to do to make that conclusion, especially when the Hebrew is very specific about what's happening, right? And of course, this is a very uncomfortable thing. We're talking about Genesis, we're talking about angels, and this is fantastical. Yeah, it sounds like Lord of the Rings or something, right? But this is what was...
C.S. Lewis might have been onto some things.
Right. But this is what was believed up until the time of Constantine, et cetera, when this became an uncomfortable truth, or however you want to really... And then it was easier. But then you have to go and say, okay, well, the Nephilim has to just be mighty men. You have to deconstruct things and reconstruct them that doesn't actually line up with the linguistics, the language, the original language, et cetera, to try to make this all fit. And then there weren't giants. Okay, then they were just mighty men. Then how does that work? And then you have to kind of we got to massage all these measurements. And you kind of get into this space of just fallacy after fallacy after fallacy to get to a point where to feel comfortable, like in your moody Bible commentary, like I have, to say this was just bad dudes taking wives, and all of a sudden there's something out extraordinary happens. That just isn't.
Yeah, I remember Heiser on a podcast. He said, the average seminary graduate will get 1 to 2 hours on angels and demons. That's it. Like their whole, all their teaching.
Yeah,
and this is why I think there's this huge gap, and why I think our show has gotten to where it is, because you have all these people with these questions and they don't get any answers. But most people who come on our show talking about something else have a paranormal experience they can't explain, whether they've seen Bigfoot, or they've seen some sort of demonic manifestation, or they've seen a ghost, or they've seen a UFO, or whatever it is. And a lot of people actually silently suffer with these attacks, like a lot of the alien abduction stuff that nobody wants to talk about. They think it's Hollywoodized. People actually regularly, nightly deal with this, and they pray and they silently suffer. And it's sad, because what Luke and I have experienced is people don't want their names out there. They haven't told anybody. We've had several people say, I've never told this story to anybody. And I'm like, your kids? No, I haven't even talked to my kids about it. Why us? Why now? So we've given this space to people to open up and be honest, but we started with the data and talking about what the Bible says. This is the most plausible.
Yeah. And that's what would have been the context, is how do we interpret and filter all the weird through a biblical paradigm?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Genesis, right? Like, I think that one of the things that was mind-blowing was, Genesis 3 is the first prophecy in the Bible, right? It's that God says that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. and the serpent will deliver a blow to the seed of the woman, a fatal blow. And so you have this prophecy of Christ, right? And I had never constructed in my own paradigm the Old Testament in a way that to understand that once that happens, it sets off a chain of events, right? Because now this has been prophesied. God himself has prophesied this over the darkness, over the rebellion, over the serpent rebellion, saying, a human, the seed of the woman, is going to be your demise, and the end of you. And then shortly after, you see this Genesis 6 event. And so if you look at it in that context, you're seeing what's happening here. Well, part of what's happening here is the rebellion. These angels that rebel are genetically changing the pool on earth. And if you will, it's a seed war. We've talked kind of this idea of a seed war. I'm not sure if Darren's covered this or not, but like the idea that a lot of the things that happen downstream from the serpent in the garden and the fall of Adam and Eve and God prophesying this is all a direct correlation to that. And Genesis 6 is part of that. If we can remove humanity from the equation, then the seed of the woman can't crush the head of the serpent, can't crush our rebellion. And then you get to the flood and you go, this is why it's happening. Noah was pure, and God's got to take these fully humans and take them into a safe space, into an ark, and remove them, and then judge this, abomination, this creation, this manipulation of DNA by the darkness, in a sense. And then you go, well, of course, the Christ had to come. And we went back to we just talked about the virgin birth and all those things. Christ had to come as fully God, fully man, the Son of Man. And his line, and there's so much genealogy in the New Testament, if you want to skip ahead, that goes all the way back to Adam. Why does it do that?
Yeah, we talked about that in chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 is all the lineage, from Adam to Noah.
Right.
And the importance of that from Noah all the way forward. But for you guys too, when we talk about angels and demons, right?
Yeah.
It's after having listened to your podcast and obviously studying on our own and having these discussions, it's an oversimplification, right? To have two categories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Binary. Yeah.
Very binary. Because we even asked this question to Hugh Ross. At least I did when I had the chance on our podcast.
Sure.
When we were talking about aliens, right?
Yeah.
The A word. And for him, it was very binary. Those are angels or demons. But, having studied this and listening, to you guys and your guests and the folks that you've had on, I think we've all learned that that's more than just two boxes to check, two categories, two silos.
Yeah.
Expound on that. What do you think that you have, what conclusions perhaps have you come to in terms of the potential categories for the different types of creatures, or how do you explain aliens, and would you agree it's not as binary as just angels and demons?
Yeah, I mean, I think demons is, mostly people will say it's a disembodied spirit. It's actually a spirit, and we know the spirit is a thing, right? We know, there's many instances in the New Testament where people thought they were seeing ghosts, the ghost of Peter, the ghost of Jesus. They knew what a ghost was, but a demon is something different. So they had some sort of categorization. They knew what the differences of these things were. People will see physical creatures. They'll see a physical Bigfoot. They'll see physical gray. They'll see a physical craft. What is that? Since when is a demon have an assembly line building craft? It doesn't happen, right?
It doesn't have a body. Yeah.
So what Christians get, their initial reaction is fear. Oh, I'm afraid of this because I don't understand it. I don't know. All I know is there's these three characters. There's angels, humans, and then there's these bad spirit things, and then there's God. But I don't know how to make sense of anything else. And so we get a lot of people that react to those things, but there seems to be a hierarchy of characters, is a cherub a specific type of angel versus a watcher,
Or seraphim.
Maybe there's a class of angels that are like us, and then maybe there's some that are a next level, they have different abilities. I don't know. I mean, we know that, the sons of God is a term used in Job. It's used in Genesis. It's describing not, and it says the daughters of men. So, and Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. So we know there's a difference between these beings and us. But I think that when we lay out the characters, when we talk about them, what we usually do an episodic. We try to tackle a specific topic or a specific creature. And I think that Blurry Creatures has grown just from talking about a paranormal sighting of something that shouldn't exist that does, to, basically some theology that the church doesn't want to talk about. Is Jesus in that category of he's God, but he's also human, and
it gets blurry pretty quick.
It gets blurry.
And I think too that when we're talking about our ideas, we just interview folks, so we're just sort of soaking in.
Yeah.
And Dr. Michael Heiser, who we reference again, we had him on the show twice, and I think his work. He's a PhD in ancient Semitic languages, ancient Hebrew, and one of the things is the Bible is very vague, right? Elohim. When Nate's talking about the sons of God, it's Ben Elohim, and it means it's really hard to make that anything other than a divine creature.
I was going to ask you about that. The divine council, the Elohim.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's used, right, and it's used for God, the Elohim singular, and then Elohim, Ben Elohim, the sons of God, which is the implication of divine nature. Elohim is also used plural, but the Hebrew itself is still somewhat vague, right? You can use different sources, but the truth is when in those places, like Psalm 82, which is Heiser's famous spot, right? And then in the Hebrew in Genesis, it can not be anything but a divine creature. And one thing I've said just on our show, and just in my own opinion, is if we look around us here on Earth and being humans, there's billions of different species and types of creation here. And I think we probably sell ourselves short if our imagining or our ideas of heaven is, like you said, is so binary, just God and angels, right? Because when we hear about heaven, or the Bible talks about heaven, there's roads and walls and buildings and all these different things that seem to kind of talk about civilization. So my hypothesis is that there is a plethora of created beings that exist in that space, and we kind of broad brush it. And when we talk about demons are a specific thing. Mike came on the show and was talking about demons are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. That's what they are.
Yeah.
They're a disembodied spirit, as Nate said. So then you have fallen angels. So because angel's such a vague...
That's a good distinction.
Because such a vague thing, Elohim, right? You have the Ben Elohim, you have these fallen angels. It doesn't really give you a lot of category or kingdom or phylum. It's very broad, but it's just a very different thing than... And then at least we know, and it depends how you can take a lot of views. And there's a practical view, like Nate was talking about, that or that angels take a form. It's like a poof theory. We don't know. We can't say with any kind of certainty how that works, except that angels do very physical things, and demons, as we know in the New Testament, they inhabit other vessels, bodies. When Christ casts the demon, the legion, out of the demoniac at the tombs, they ask to go in pigs. They want to go into another body. This is not the behavior of, say, an angel. This is a very different thing. And so when people want to broad brush everything's demons, whether it be UFOs or aliens, those things actually, like from a very practical standpoint, don't operate in
just
the way
more complex.
Yeah, there's much more going on here. Now, do we know specifically? No, but I think we can define what a demon is. And when you do sort of reverse engineer that, you can go, well, it's definitely not this, right?
I think too is like a lot of what we do is give context, because it's sometimes the Bible's more of bullet points and highlight reel. I mean, Genesis is going through a lot of stuff very quickly.
6 is 4 verses.
It doesn't give you, like the whole outline and the play-by-play of, what Moses was doing, all day long. It doesn't, it's just these miraculous events happen. They're part of the story. They're part of the overarch, So let's put them in there. And I think most of us will read these stories and be like, wait. And we have this skepticism. This couldn't have happened. This didn't happen. And so what we do a lot on our show is try to find more context, things, stories, just like any event, any sort of wild or weird thing that happens.
Witnesses, testimonials.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And that's a big part of
building a case.
Why people believe Jesus resurrected because eyewitness accounts. And they were there. And so people were just so quick to dismiss, well, you saw something, well, you were on drugs, or you were imagining it, or, you have a mental health disorder, or whatever it is. And I think we are always trying to give more context. So there's extra biblical literature that is quoted all over the New Testament, things like the Book of Enoch. And people are always afraid of those things. But it's something that, like Heiser said, I heard him on many shows say that, they were all the writers of the New Testament. They read everything. They knew everything. They weren't afraid of information. Now, some of it isn't considered like, canon and, divine or whatever you want, whatever.
Finally inspired.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about that, I think, a couple podcasts ago. We dove in a little bit about the Book of Enoch.
Sure.
But you guys reference it often on your podcast.
Yeah.
Would love your insight with our listeners to your take on the Book of Enoch 1 specifically, and why we say 1 specifically.
Yeah. Well, this is timely because we're releasing a version of the Book of Enoch with our friend Tim Alberino, who's been a part of our show, a number of episodes, also Blurry Con, as you preferenced, and the next one coming up.
Tentatively June 11th right now, tentatively.
That's incredible.
But so there's really three Enochs. And so the first is the ancient one. And we know it's ancient because it was discovered in at Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was the second most copied book by the Essenes in Qumran. So it's very ancient. Second and third are second temple. Third is really weird. It's a Gnostic thing. So those ones are going to be part of our book because you want to have them all. Those are not what we're referencing. Really, First Enoch is the one that's quoted in the New Testament in Jude and First Peter. Also paraphrased a number of times in the New Testament, especially the Book of Watchers. And what it really is it's an expose. It's an expounding upon Genesis 6. It fills in the story.
Yeah.
Because Genesis 6 is 4 verses, right? And so what does this mean? What happened? And this is what happened. It names players. It names villains. It talks about the things that these fallen angels did, and that taught humanity. And then of course Enoch is the main character in this, and he is called upon as somebody's taken up into heaven. At that part, he's called upon to really, he's like a lawyer, if you will, for the fallen angels that are being judged.
Yeah.
And they asked him to on their behalf to make a plea to God, right? And so he's sort of representing. It's just really interesting because, not to divert too much, but when we think about the supernatural realm, it operates so legalistically. We talk about anything from deliverance to the way that things operate. It's so legal. And then you have this courtroom scene. The same thing in Psalm 82, this courtroom scene. Yeah. God works from a very legal standpoint. And then First Enoch is really what happened. And then Enoch representing these fallen angels before they're judged. Ultimately, they're judged and put into Tartarus. But as Nate said, right, and Mike Heiser said, the writers of the New Testament were very well read, and this was something that they referenced, was most likely studied in temple, and they knew. And they referenced to the point where when they were doing the canon, putting the canon together, they didn't have any, because of the destruction of the Second Temple, they didn't have any copies of this. So they actually at the time thought First Enoch was plagiarizing or lifting from Jude and First Peter, like this is contemporary. And it wasn't until it was discovered in Qumran, in the ancients, they realized, okay, no.
Yeah, it was older.
It's older, and they're actually quoting that. And so, amazing. Take it for what it is, right? It's not.
But those concepts are only found, like I said, that in the Book of Enoch. If you want to know the angels that sinned that he's talking about, where does that come from?
Right.
What angels that sinned? How do angels sin? These entire, but it's like little blips, and so you can just glaze over it and be like, oh, we're not gonna talk about that in First Peter. We're not gonna talk about what Jude said. I think it's easier to kind of just go to sort of the main points that most churches like to talk about. But a lot of people who, they get to an age and they're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense.
Right. There's just too many gaps that need to be filled in. One of my favorite verses is Genesis 5:24, when it says, Enoch walked faithfully with God, and he was no more because he took him away.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, wait a minute, time out. Like, where did he go?
Yeah.
How did he get there? Where is he now?
Just got picked up on the old
Elijah
in the DeLorean.
Elijah went as well.
Yeah, Enoch and Elijah. It's like, how did this happen?
Maybe the two witnesses maybe at the end too. There's a whole.
And we've talked about that a little bit. And I think that's a fantastic.
But it's context, right? It's all context. It's like, no matter what you think about this book, it's giving you more context to how to read the books that you consider, part of the Bible. Well, these people are talking about these other ideas. And even when on our episode with Tim, I remember he was talking about when Jesus says, they're in my Father's house, there are many mansions. If we're not so, I would have told you. That whole idea is talked about in Enoch, what mansions? And why is he defending it? If it were not so, I would have, because this concept, there are mansions, there's a place being prepared. This not talked about anywhere else in Scripture. So what is he talking
the term
about?
Son of Man.
Yeah.
The term Christ calls himself Son of Man is nowhere in Scripture, but it is in 1 Enoch. It's never used until Christ calls himself the Son of Man. And you go, where's that from? Well, 1 Enoch, if you read it, there's a ton of messianic prophecy in it.
Yeah, tons.
And it's interesting. The book's interesting because the beginning talks about this. So this is not for this time, but for a distant time. And then lo and behold, it's lost. And you have the destruction of the second temple. The Romans tear every stone, even the cornerstones as Christ prophesied, is removed. All of this stuff is lost. And then it's preserved because of what the Essenes did at Qumran by some goat herders that happened to find all these this amazing history and copies of, not just the books of the Bible, like the Isaiah scrolls, incredible, and Genesis, but there's First Enoch and they were an apocryphal sect, if you will. They were waiting for the end. And so Enoch is very much about the end. And so that makes sense from that standpoint. But the fact it existed then, that just predates Christ, gives the validity that say, okay, they knew this. It's like, a bad example, like we've all, in our generation, we all had to read, Huckleberry Finn or whatever. Like we know that story.
Yeah.
Right? For what it is. And so that provides this cultural context from which explains the Genesis 6. So it's a bad analogy. I can redo it here. Maybe it's like Wedding Crashers. Like if we quote it, we all know it. We all know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Or Tombstone, right?
Well, it's just like Josephus' works during the time of Christ.
Yes.
It's very historical.
Right.
Yeah. It's not canon, but it's history.
And it's evidence. And
evidence.
This is another piece that helps to ratify, if you will, or bolster this story. And
and I think just the mindset in general, there was not as many skeptics. I don't think you had sect of people who didn't believe in things. I think you had
nihilists, like in The Big Lebowski. You believe in nothing.
You know what I mean? The entire, and I think of, something modern that we've come to understand now, like an iPhone or in the internet. We've had 20 years of the internet now, more than 20 years of the internet. So it's like these concepts. If you and I were talking in a conversation, it was being written down and someone said, log on, what's the Wi-Fi? You're not going to spend 20 chapters trying to explain what the internet is, what the connection is, what is Wi-Fi, what's a password. Nobody knows these things, but those terms are dropped a lot in the Bible. And then nobody is thinking, thousands of years from now, people are going to read these concepts and they're not going to know what a Nephilim is. Let's explain what the Nephilim are in the next 10 chapters. It just uses those terms and it moves on. And so it's not trying to hold your hand. It's not trying to make you believe, as a skeptical modern human in the 21st century, we don't believe in these things. Well, it doesn't care.
That's Heiser's quote too, right? Like it's written for you, but not to you.
Yeah.
Like the idea that was cultural bedrock. That was cultural knowledge. It was nuance. It was something that was understood within the context of the story.
Yeah.
That we miss because we're separated by time, by millennia.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what's so fascinating. Mike would say, like he never had any new ideas, but he just compiled the work of the scribes, and then he just encouraged people to read the Bible as in the context it was written as an ancient Semitic person.
Yeah.
And that in itself is mind-blowing because I think so often in the 21st century church, we want to read ourselves into it as we're the hero, we're David, we're we're Moses, we're Abraham, and like it's not it. That ain't it. Actually, it's not it at all, right?
Or that they had a whole life of paranormal events.
Right.
Some of them only had moments, maybe one or two moments in their career where they had like a burning bush.
Yeah, Samson got his hair cut, man, one time, and that was it, bro.
But it's like, if we dug up your journal, right, 1,000 years from now, and you're like, today I interviewed the Blurry Creatures guys, and we had a live stream, they would be spending a long time trying to figure out what the heck is a live stream? What is that? And they'd be looking at all these little fragments of other stuff, trying to figure out what a live stream is, because in 1,000 years, it's going to be something totally different, right? And I think that's...
If we're there.
If we make it, things are getting real quick.
A little weird out there.
But, that's kind of what we have to do and what we do on our podcast, because a lot of these conversations are not welcome on Sunday morning. They're not welcome... Even in families and at around the dinner table, people are like, they get real upset. They And I think we have just adopted.
Don't bring that Nephilim talk here to Thanksgiving. Don't you dare.
We've adopted a posture of like, you can come on our show and say weird things. We don't agree with everything you say, but we definitely will hear you out and say, okay, you have 10,000 hours. And I think one of the most mind-blowing things that we always incur is how someone will come on, a theologian, a doctor, somebody who's completely in a different sect of life and knowledge will tell you, my grandpa saw Bigfoot. And he swears to this day, and he went to his deathbed or whatever it is, and he tells this story. Or I saw something that I can't explain every single time. And then over 4 years, only like 2 or 3 people have no thoughts on these creatures. But it's like, wow, people don't talk. People are afraid to communicate. People are afraid to express themselves. People are afraid to ask weird questions.
Why? Why are they afraid?
I think that's the same reason why they were afraid of the Book of Enoch.
It's just not safe.
It's just too weird. It doesn't fit into my normal day, everyday life, because they read the Old Testament maybe and they think all this crazy stuff is going on for them, but it doesn't happen now. And then they have these whole, sects of Christianity who just say miracles don't happen anymore. Like, what? Like, are you kidding?
And that point, I think, is why these conversations are so important, Mo, and especially what you guys do in a Conduit now, is because if you don't discuss these things or don't ask about the weird, don't try to unwrap and talk about the weird stuff, whether it be in the Bible or people's experiences, you don't try to do that because you've built this safe space around what your faith as you would, right? Which is really ironic in the sense of what we talked about earlier, right? We believe in some really crazy stuff, but what we're trying to do is have these conversations and say, maybe all of these things fit inside our faith, because if you don't have these discussions and you've had an experience, maybe you had like you saw a UFO or you're going to go look for answers. Right. And when you look for it outside the church and outside your faith, the world's more than willing to disciple you in what they think you should believe. And that's never going to be from a biblical worldview. It's never going to be within the context of the gospel of Christ. It's never going to be that way. And what we contend is that there are answers in the biblical narrative. There are answers in our faith. And all we have to do is really just have the discussions and suss it out. Because, Mike Heiser, again, not to beat a dead horse, but Mike came on and said, listen, one of the famous things on our show, he said, all these accounts, whatever it is, Bigfoot or UFOs or aliens, if just one is true, all the other ones, just say other ones are lies, just one is true. Breaks the paradigm. And you got to find a way to put that into your worldview and make that make sense. And I do think that the things that are accelerating and happening right now, Nate and Mo, in our culture, we have House oversight committees on UAPs last year, UFOs, right? If we don't have these discussions and talk about it from a context of the Bible, which, by the way, completely holds up when it comes to these topics, then a lot of people are going to be deceived. They're going to walk away and say, this disqualifies my faith. Aliens and this stuff disqualifies my faith. UFOs disqualifies my faith. A big hairy ape man running around in the woods disqualifies his faith. That isn't in the Bible. That can't be real. People are going to walk away from the truth because they're not finding answers to the questions. And then what we contend is just let's have a discussion. Let's look for better answers. And and I keep coming back to it. Like the Bible, God. There's a cosmic reality to the Bible that I think we've divorced ourselves in the 21st century post-Enlightenment. And it's a very supernatural faith. And the ancients didn't divorce the natural from the supernatural. It was a reality. And we've kind of come to this space where we hold these things in two different hands. But again, like our faith is so very supernatural, cosmic, if you will. We talking donkeys, a resurrected Christ, giants. You either believe it all or I think it invalidates everything.
Having ears to hear is a concept. It isn't that I'm a Christian and all of a sudden I have ears to hear. It's like I have to humble myself and continue. A lot of these people who have monumental parts of the story, these things happen later in their life after they grew over a period of time. You have to have a relationship with God, and it's testing. It's different. Can you handle this task? Okay, then you can handle this task. It's not like we wake up one day as a Christian and all of a sudden we have the ability to understand all the cosmos and everything God has created. And you have to sort of have that intellectual humility to go, okay, I'm going to put this in there and I'm going to think about this.
Chew on it.
And some of these stories, and I think to Luke's point, some people go mad. They get driven mad. There's all these stories. You watch any paranormal show, like someone saw a UFO in their backyard and it ruined their marriage because they got so obsessed and they couldn't make any sense of it. Or they saw a Bigfoot creature and they spent the rest of their life and their life savings trying to find it again, because it just becomes this unhealthy obsession because nobody will talk about it. And I think the most damaging part of it is people won't believe their own stories. Something will have happened to them and they don't believe it.
Just dismiss it.
They can't.
Use it away.
How do you admit to yourself, this is happening, this is my reality? And that is the most destructive. And I think that happens on all kinds of, people have traumas and they don't even want to believe that happened to them, let alone. And some of these events are traumatic. You're seeing something that shouldn't exist. And so I think we feel like there's a counseling part of what we do too. Sure. Like, you're welcome here to drop your burden, drop your load, because I know that you're carrying this around, and people look at us like we're nuts because of what we talk about.
I would say, like, do we agree with everything on the show? Absolutely not. But I think, like I said, I think
sometimes you don't think that someone is making something up because it seems like a burden they're carrying. Why would they come on? Sure. They feel like they need to drop this thing. And I think, But
you chew the meat and spit out the bones, right?
Yeah.
I think having discussions like this are so important, especially in a time where it's so ripe for deception.
Well, yeah. I mean, here at Conduit, for sure, we try to double down on biblical literacy.
Yes.
Like, we feel like in our culture, I think it's safe to say in our culture today, biblical literacy is close to, I hate making like gross generalizations, but it's close to an all-time low. Biblical literacy, understanding what the Bible says. And I think for us, that's something we want to double down on, is teaching the Bible and asking the hard questions and creating a format and an environment where we can have these discussions. So that's like first and foremost for us here at Conduit, which is why we would even know about your podcast or even
we're the same way. Like, go read your Bible and open up your Bible. It's the greatest.
And I think a better
story
way.
ever told.
I think a better way to think about this. I mean, we're an '80s show. We always use like '80s movies to like explain and market our show, right? Just because we're both kids of the '80s. But there's one of the best '80s movies, The Never-Ending Story, right? I mean, he realizes he's in the story as he's reading it, and I think that's the best way to read the Bible. You're in the story. You're a character in this. You're not the character in this. You're down here somewhere. You're important, but you're not the only thing that matters. You're not the only thing that's out there. And I think that once you start to realize, oh man, I'm like at a point in time. I'm at the end of an age here. And I've been dropped into existence at this point in time. And all these people have been fighting against, there's been a spiritual war. We're in the middle of it. We're caught in a crossfire between heaven and hell.
A cosmic battle.
Yeah. And sometimes we have these times where there's no fighting. There's no war going on. People are just bunkered down for a couple weeks, but that's millennia to the spiritual realm. Like, that could be thousands of years where things aren't happening the same way, like 40 years in the, wandering in the wilderness, maybe they had one day where it was a burning bush, or, a cloud shows up and they follow, whatever it is. It's not always strange all the time. And I think that right now, somebody listening to this podcast has had a paranormal experience. I know it's true. And they've been telling themselves their whole life it didn't happen. But when you start to hear these conversations like, that did happen to me, and they begin to change their mind. And I think we have to read the Bible as if we're in the middle of the story at a specific time. Let's say this movie is, an hour and a half. We're kind of getting closer to the end of the movie, and it's starting to get wrapped up. And we have to go all the way back and be like, okay, this started with these characters, and then this guy came, and this guy died, and this guy came, and then this whole event happened, and then there was a flood, and realize we're in it. We're in the war. We're a part of it, and we're a character, and we're called to do something about that. And I'm not detached from the story.
Dr. Phil. Look at you.
But I think that's when it started to come alive to me. And that, like Heiser said, don't bore me with the Bible. It's not boring. I grew up in the church. I grew up going to Christian school, Christian camps, and a lot of times it was boring. Nobody wanted to talk about anything that was strange, and nobody really. And then once it got a little strange and weird, then I started to get on the edge of my seat and go, wait a minute, talk about that. What is that? And I think that's what we try to do. That's where the podcast birthed out of. It was like, these are the weird conversations, and we're going to have those. We don't feel like we're theology experts. We don't have doctorate degrees. But if it's weird and it seems, and there's some data to it,
Dr. Meme,
let's talk about it.
Right.
It's got a place here in Blurry Creatures, and I think that is, with some humility because we don't know anything. Oh. But we're willing to like let you have your 10,000 hours. You wrote a book about something. Come on a show, talk about it. But not like Joe Rogan where it just gets crazy and weird and then he's very skeptical. We're kind of like, okay, if we funnel this through a biblical worldview, then there's plausibility to everything that's being said right now.
And trusting the listeners that they can make up their own minds. Like here's some info, here's some data, and here's a hypothesis, and like do with it. Yeah, exactly. But you have the ability to make up your mind, and if we're going to filter that through the Bible, that's the best way to do that. Now, when you're trying to answer unanswerable questions, you just get better answers. You don't get like you're not going to get a.
It's not going to disprove the Bible. It's only going to make the Bible more true.
Read.
And deeper and richer, and then Christ coming to save us is way more epic and full, and he's saving us from a lot more than just ourselves.
Yeah, and as we wrap up here, one of the you just mentioned a minute ago, like we're getting to the end of the chapter, right? So
it seems
as if. So history can inform the future.
Yeah,
in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
And Jesus says, as in the days of Noah, right? So
where we'll be again.
Where are we at? Where are we? What is happening right now?
Yeah, I think the days of Noah is like rebellion beyond just moral rebellion. It's like genetic rebellion. It is like anything God made, any system God designed, we're going to screw it up. And I think that they were sinning against. It says they're sinning against animals in the Book of Enoch, and all flesh is corrupted. I mean, that's also a biblical concept. What does that mean? How do you sin against beasts and plants and human beings? And I think this genetic tempering that we've been doing the last 30 years is finally going to get to a place where I wonder if the days of Noah forced God's hand because there was things here that shouldn't be here, and eventually we play mad scientist to the point where God has to get involved and like, you can't do that. You can't do that to my creation. You can't do that to my people. So I think we're getting close, and especially with AI and
yeah, I was going to ask you. So like AI, bioengineered everything, all of these different things, nanotechnology. Well, is this the
I think one of the most interesting things on that note, from a very, very simplistic idea, is that, and this is Tim Alberino's idea. This is not my idea, but the idea that like there's a very small part of our DNA that makes us human and separates us from the rest of creation. It's a very small piece. I don't know if we're like 90.
You call that the image of God, right?
Right. And we're at the point now where we can probably more likely remove that portion of our own DNA. And part of that, from a very simple idea, is as Tim would say, is our birthright is dominion. So God gave the earth to Adam and all that was in it, and told him to subdue creation and be fruitful and multiply. You're in Genesis. So what does that mean? Well, it means that this is our space. Paul says we'll judge angels here. This is our realm. If you think about, the kingdom of heaven and these places as realms, as a kingdom, this is ours. We're at the point now where we genetically, technology-wise, we can dehumanize ourselves, like technically speaking.
That could be the like unforgivable sin, right? Where you convert yourself to something that is no longer human. You're no longer redeemable. You're no longer to be saved.
And then we forfeit our birthright and our dominion here. And then that becomes usurpable by the beast, by the rebellion.
And you get the whole Neuralink thing happening.
Right. I mean, so there's all these things, right? Like, can we genetically upgrade ourselves to humanity 2.0? Can we modify our genes, epigenetics and all these things to, in the idea of like curing cancer and doing all these really good things, but really there's a nefarious side to every coin, which is to remove those things that make us human, right?
Yeah, like
and everything's about a seed war from the beginning in Genesis 3.
And knowledge, right? And it's like, he's promised knowledge, and then God, you won't die. You won't die. And so there's these things that with human beings always want. We want more, we want to know more, we want to have more knowledge, and we don't want to die. We want to stay here. We want to stay the fountain of youth. We want to continue on. We're actually afraid of judgment. We're afraid of the next life. We don't know. Most of us are live in fear on a daily basis.
Pursuing immortality.
Yeah. And we spend billions of dollars trying to stay young, and we don't want to be a grandpa by 44. You know what I'm saying?
Hey, being a grandpa at 44 is amazing.
That's like 40 chess.
But I think eventually the technology is getting to the point where it's going to be like Terminator, self-aware. And I think at that point, how they did things in the ancient times, I don't know. I don't know how they sinned against how they created these chimerical creatures, which all were rumored to exist, and some people come on our show that still see these things to this day, that you're like, that's mythology. That didn't happen. You're like, well, people are still seeing these things, so either they're lying or they're still around in some pockets of the world. But I think that this blend of like modern technology and ancient technology, and trying to tempt humans to say you can't have modern immortality.
It's the temptation of the garden. You can be like
it's a different form of it. It's like the days of Noah, but it comes in this package that's new and fresh, and sounds like you're in line at the Apple store waiting for it, and it's you're conditioned to upgrade. And eventually, I think the problem is if humans convert themselves to human 2.0, the questions are you still under God's jurisdiction at that point?
Wow,
have you converted yourself to something that's not? And how are you going to compete? How are you going to compete in a world where you've got superhumans running around? So, the demigods, the Nephilim, the mighty men that Genesis talks about, they were men of renown, famous. Why were they famous? Because they had this knowledge that we didn't have. They were human 2.0. So the days of Noah will be a temptation, I think, to become human 2.0. It won't maybe be because angels and humans are hooking up. It'll be more like they give you the same thing, but it's a different delivery system. So I think that is, like you said, history repeats itself. That's sort of the temptation, I think.
Solomon said nothing to do with their son. So like we know that it's the same deceptions are always shopped to humanity. They just get remarketed.
Yeah.
It's different marketing.
Yeah.
It's different packaging, right? And I think that's as you're saying, like that's it, right? They'll be offering. They're offering this. There's a hybridization, just like in the Old Testament, where you're becoming not human, right? It's coming, and it's coming a lot faster. I think if you look at the advancement of technology just in the last 30 years or last 10 years, there's just been a dramatic speeding up of development and discoveries and technological advances that it feels like we're barreling towards something seismic.
No doubt about it.
It's close. It feels close, and I just.
And just paranormal experiences that people are having seem to be on the up.
The veil seems to be lifted.
Yeah, people are
like
seeing
Waterworld,
weirder
man.
stuff.
We're going to be like, Kevin Costner.
Yeah.
Just looking for that.
Yeah,
a real piece of ground.
Well, you got your shorts ready. You just need a jet ski.
I'm ready, baby. Kenny Powers, man. Give me that purple cheetah jet ski.
Nate and Luke, thank you for spending time with us.
No problem.
You guys are the best.
Yeah,
you guys have been so good to Blurry Creatures and to us and to our families, to the people that love the show. Like you guys are just even incredible, and we're again BlurryCon 2 is happening here. So we're going to be back at it.
Yeah, we'll send your normal fans to us. We'll send our weird fans to you. How about
it's
that?
already happening. It's already happened. We get quite the interesting emails.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks for putting up with that.
Makes my day getting those texts from you guys.
That's why we say we're two dummies, so that people will email everybody else and not us.
Like,
they don't know.
They don't know anything. All they do is quote movies.
We're not going to harass those guys. They don't know what they're talking about, but they harass anyone who comes on our show or anyone who has written a book. So, but seriously, no, thank you for having us and like hosting our events and just being real friends in this. Because I think that over the years, Luke and I have realized like we've taken on a little bit of a burden doing this. It's a little strange. Like
heavy too.
It's very heavy.
Yeah.
And talking about stuff that nobody wants to talk about or believes, especially when it comes to like satanic ritual abuse and some of the darker parts of our show. I mean, it's a part of Christianity that nobody wants to look at because it's not fun, it's not glamorous, and then you just get a lot of people who want to. I think it's a spiritual attack. Christians will turn on themselves, and anyone who's worked in a church knows this. The worst part of it is the fans or the fellowship turning on the pastors, the staff, you know what I mean? We cannibalize ourselves as Christians. And I think that's a spiritual attack. It's like, this gets into people's heads and they cause division and they cause people to hate each other and they sow dissent in the church. So, I always try to encourage people to like, just don't be that, don't do that. You guys are producing content. You're providing a place for people to gather. And it's like, don't take away, don't give to the church, give to God's, give to the kingdom of heaven. Don't take away from it. And don't don't destroy it. If you don't like it, go somewhere else. But, I think that there is some burden. So it's good to have friendships in this. And
Darren went to Peru with us.
Yeah.
That's right.
You didn't, Mo. We hold that against
Mo's
you slightly.
coming.
Next time.
Yeah. Bring the boys.
BlurryCreatures.com. You can listen to them wherever you listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
And you have a book coming.
Yeah.
Couple weeks.
Couple of weeks.
Should be June 11th.
Book of Enoch. Commentary by Tim Alberino. So on the book
we are doing a live event in Nashville too. If you want to come, August 3rd, there is tickets available for. We're doing like a paranormal round with like 4 other big podcasts that are kind of in our vein. It's called Squatchella, and
how fun is that?
You can go to squatchella.com or our website and get tickets to that too. So if you want to see it live,
it's great.
Got a few things still out there.
Cooking, baby.
Love it. Love what you guys are doing. Appreciate
Thanks,
you guys making time for us today.
Yeah.
If you want to know more, blurrycreatures.com. And then, of course, if you want to know more about this, the series that we're going through, the book of Genesis, scroll back through our YouTube channel. You can listen to the previous teachings. We're going to be back in Genesis 7, I believe, this Sunday. Darren will be back with us. And if you have any emails or any questions that you want to email us, let's send those to Darren this week. Darren at ConduitChurch.com. He'll be glad to get back with you on those. But thank you for joining the Deeper podcast with us today.